You think you know Walter White. You think Breaking Bad is about a desperate father doing desperate things for his family. You're wrong. And if you're a father watching this, you're about to face the most uncomfortable truth of your life. Walter White never cooked methamphetamine for his family. He did it for his ego. And every father watching recognizes himself in him because we've all told ourselves the same lie. I'm going to destroy everything you believe about Walter White, about masculinity, and about what it really means to be a provider. Because Walter White isn't the tragic hero Breaking Bad wants you to believe he is. He's the shadow that follows every man who's ever used the word family to justify feeding his own demons. This isn't just a story about a chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin. This is a story about every father who's ever convinced himself that his worst impulses are actually noble sacrifices. It's about every man who's ever looked in the mirror and seen a provider when the reflection shows a predator. Are you ready to meet the real Walter White? Because once you see him for what he really is, you can never unsee it. And more importantly, you might start questioning what kind of father you really are. The story begins where all masculine destruction begins. With a wounded ego and a convenient excuse. Walter White receives his cancer diagnosis on his 50th birthday. 50 years old, high school chemistry teacher, working a second job at a car wash, watching his former business partners become millionaires off research he helped develop. The cancer isn't what breaks Walter White. The cancer is what gives him permission to finally be who he always wanted to be. Here's what Breaking Bad doesn't want you to notice. Walter White makes his first batch of methamphetamine before he even tells his family about the cancer. Think about that. A man finds out he's dying, and his first instinct isn't to spend time with his family or get his affairs in order. His first instinct is to feel powerful. This is the great lie of masculine provision. We tell ourselves we're doing it for them, but we're really doing it for us. Walter could have taken money from Elliot and Gretchen. His former business partners offered to pay for his entire treatment, no questions asked. But Walter refuses. Why? Because taking help makes him feel small. Cooking meth makes him feel big. Every father watching this knows that feeling. That moment when providing for your family stops being about love and starts being about proving something. When you stop asking what your family needs and start asking what makes you feel like a man. Walter's first lie isn't to the DA or to Skylar. His first lie is to himself. He tells himself he's doing this for his family's financial security. But watch his face when he's cooking. That's not the face of a man making a sacrifice. That's the face of a man finally feeling alive. This is where the masculine shadow begins. Not with evil intentions, but with noble rationalizations covering selfish needs. Walter doesn't become the danger because he loves his family. He becomes the danger because he's finally found something that makes him feel dangerous. And every father watching feels that recognition in their gut because we've all been there. Maybe not cooking meth, but working late not because the family needs the money but because work makes us feel important. Taking on projects not because they're necessary but because they make us feel valuable. Providing not because they asked for it but because providing makes us feel like providers. Walter White's cancer doesn't create a monster. It reveals one that was always there, waiting for the right excuse to come out and play. The second lie Walter tells himself is bigger than the first. He tells himself that because his motivation started pure, everything that follows is still pure. This is the masculine trap that destroys families. We judge our actions by our original intentions, not by their actual consequences. Walter partners with Jesse Pinkman, his former student, and immediately the pattern emerges. Walter isn't teaching Jesse chemistry to help him. He's teaching Jesse chemistry to feel superior. Walter doesn't want a partner. He wants an audience for his brilliance. Watch how Walter treats Jesse in those early episodes. That's not mentorship. That's domination disguised as guidance. Walter needs Jesse to be lesser so Walter can be greater. This is the dark heart of masculine provision. It's not about lifting others up. It's about standing on top of them. But Walter tells himself he's helping Jesse get his life together. He tells himself he's being responsible by ensuring quality product. He tells himself he's doing everything for the right reasons. And this is the lie that every toxic father tells himself. That his need to control others is actually care for others. Skylar starts asking questions. Where has Walter been? Why is he acting strange? And instead of honesty, Walter chooses manipulation. He doesn't just lie to Skylar. He makes her feel crazy for asking reasonable questions. He doesn't just hide his activities. He makes her doubt her own perceptions. This is where Walter White reveals what kind of father he really is. Not the kind who protects his family from the world, but the kind who protects his secrets from his family. Every lie he tells Skylar is a choice to prioritize his own comfort over her peace of mind. But Walter tells himself that he's protecting her. He tells himself that she's better off not knowing. He tells himself that his lies are acts of love. And every father who's ever hidden something from his wife recognizes this rationalization because we've all used it. We don't lie to protect them. We lie to protect ourselves from their reactions. We don't keep secrets because the truth would hurt them. We keep secrets because the truth would hurt us. Walter's relationship with Skylar becomes the blueprint for every toxic masculine relationship. The man makes unilateral decisions about what the woman can handle. The man decides what information the woman deserves. The man positions himself as the protector while actually being the primary threat to her safety. And Walter tells himself this is love. He tells himself this is what good husbands do. He tells himself that real men handle things so their wives don't have to worry. But watch Skylar's face throughout the first season. That's not the face of a woman being protected. That's the face of a woman being lied to by the person she should trust most. Walter isn't shielding Skylar from the world's dangers. He's becoming her biggest danger while telling himself he's her greatest protector. This is the masculine shadow at work. It convinces men that their need to feel important is actually service to others. It convinces men that their need to feel in control is actually protection of others. It convinces men that their need to feel superior is actually care for others. Walter White doesn't start cooking meth and then become selfish. He starts selfish and finds increasingly elaborate ways to tell himself he's selfless. The third lie is the most dangerous because it's the most seductive. Walter begins to believe that because he's smart, his way is always the right way. This is where intellectual arrogance becomes emotional violence. Walter's intelligence isn't his gift. It's his curse. Because Walter's intelligence comes with the assumption that everyone else is stupid. He doesn't see Jesse as a partner with different strengths. He sees Jesse as a liability he has to manage. He doesn't see Skylar as an equal with valid concerns. He sees Skylar as an obstacle to his plans. This is the dark side of masculine competence. When being good at something becomes justification for treating others like they're bad at everything. Walter's first major decision without Jesse's input nearly gets them both killed. But instead of learning from this, Walter doubles down. He doesn't see the failure as evidence that he needs other perspectives. He sees it as evidence that he needs more control. Watch Walter in the RV with Jesse. Jesse knows the streets. Jesse understands the dealers. Jesse has information Walter needs. But Walter can't simply learn from Jesse because learning from Jesse would mean admitting Jesse knows something Walter doesn't. And Walter's masculinity can't survive that admission. So Walter positions himself as the teacher and Jesse as the student, even in situations where Jesse is clearly more knowledgeable. Walter would rather make dangerous mistakes than admit someone else might be right. This is the masculine ego trap that destroys relationships. We'd rather be wrong and in charge than right and collaborative. We'd rather fail spectacularly than succeed humbly. Walter begins lying to Jesse the same way he lies to Skylar. Not directly but by omission. By misdirection. By making Jesse feel stupid for asking obvious questions. Walter doesn't trust Jesse with the full picture because Walter believes Jesse can't handle the full picture. But the truth is Walter doesn't trust anyone with the full picture because the full picture reveals that Walter doesn't actually have a plan. Walter is making it up as he goes along, but his masculine ego requires everyone else to believe he's always 3 steps ahead. This is the exhausting performance of toxic masculinity. The constant need to appear competent even when you feel lost. The constant need to appear in control even when everything is chaos. The constant need to appear strong even when you're terrified. Walter White isn't confident. He's terrified. But his terror makes him more dangerous, not less, because he'll do anything to avoid admitting he's afraid. And every father watching recognizes this performance because we've all done it. Standing in front of our families pretending we know what we're doing when we're actually panicking inside. Making decisions not because they're right but because making decisions makes us feel decisive. Walter White's intelligence becomes a weapon he uses against everyone who loves him. Because Walter's intelligence isn't about solving problems. It's about proving he's the smartest person in the room. The fourth lie transforms Walter from a man making bad choices into a man who believes bad choices are actually good choices when he makes them. Emilio and Crazy 8. Walter's first kills. And watch how Walter processes these deaths. He doesn't feel guilty because they were threatening him. He feels guilty because killing makes him feel powerful, and feeling powerful makes him feel guilty. But Walter tells himself that killing Emilio and Crazy 8 was self-defense. Walter tells himself that he had no choice. Walter tells himself that anyone in his position would have done the same thing. This is the lie that transforms ordinary men into monsters. Not the belief that violence is always wrong, but the belief that violence is always justified when you're the one committing it. Walter doesn't become comfortable with violence because he's evil. He becomes comfortable with violence because he's convinced himself that his violence is different from other people's violence. His violence is smart. His violence is necessary. His violence is moral. Watch Walter dispose of the bodies. That's not the behavior of a man traumatized by what he's done. That's the behavior of a man solving a problem. Walter doesn't see Emilio and Crazy 8 as human beings whose lives he ended. He sees them as obstacles he removed. This is the dehumanization that makes masculine violence possible. When other people stop being people and start being problems to solve or threats to neutralize, Walter begins carrying himself differently after these deaths. Not with guilt, but with confidence. Because Walter has crossed a line he never thought he could cross, and instead of being horrified, he feels capable. If he can kill when he needs to kill, what else might he be capable of? This is the intoxication of masculine power. Not the power to create or nurture or protect, but the power to destroy when destruction serves your purposes. Walter starts looking at problems differently. Instead of asking how to avoid conflict, he starts asking how to win conflict. Instead of seeking solutions that work for everyone, he starts seeking solutions that prove his dominance. Jesse is traumatized by the deaths. Jesse didn't sign up to be a killer. But Walter interprets Jesse's trauma as weakness. Walter doesn't see Jesse's humanity as a strength. He sees it as a liability. This is where Walter begins to see himself as special. Not special because he's moral, but special because he's willing to be immoral when necessary. Walter starts believing that his willingness to do terrible things makes him more realistic than people who won't do terrible things. Walter doesn't see his capacity for violence as a character flaw. He sees it as a character strength. Because Walter is becoming the kind of man who believes that being feared is more important than being loved. And Walter tells himself this evolution is necessary. He tells himself that the world is violent and only violent men survive it. He tells himself that his family needs him to be capable of violence to protect them from other violent men. But Walter's violence doesn't protect his family. Walter's violence puts his family in more danger. Every person Walter kills creates new enemies, new threats, new reasons for dangerous people to target the White family. Walter White doesn't become violent to protect his family. He puts his family in danger to justify his violence. The fifth lie is the most destructive because it's the most honest. Walter stops pretending his actions are about anyone other than himself, but he still insists those actions are justified. Gus Fring enters Walter's life and everything changes. Because Gus is everything Walter wants to be. Gus is calm, controlled, respected, feared, and wealthy. Gus has built an empire and Walter wants to build an empire too. But Walter tells himself that working for Gus is just business. Walter tells himself that he's just trying to make enough money to secure his family's future. Walter tells himself that once he reaches his number, he'll get out. This is the lie that every addiction tells. Just one more hit. Just one more deal. Just one more score. And then I'll stop. But Walter doesn't want to stop. Walter has finally found something he's genuinely good at, something that makes him feel alive, something that makes him feel important. Walter White has spent 50 years feeling invisible, and now people know his name. Watch Walter's face when other characters talk about Heisenberg. That's not fear or shame. That's pride. Walter White loves being feared because being feared is the opposite of being ignored. Walter begins to sabotage his own exit strategies. Every time there's an opportunity to walk away, Walter finds a reason to stay involved. Because Walter doesn't want to go back to being a high school chemistry teacher that no one respects. Skylar discovers Walter's double life, and instead of remorse, Walter feels annoyance. Because Skylar's knowledge threatens Walter's control of the narrative. As long as Skylar doesn't know, Walter can tell himself that he's protecting her. But once she knows, Walter has to face what he's actually become. And what Walter has actually become is a man who prioritizes his own emotional needs over his family's safety. Walter has put Skylar and the children in danger of retaliation from drug dealers, and when Skylar points this out, Walter doesn't feel guilty. Walter feels criticized. This is the moment when Walter White reveals his true character. Not when he starts cooking meth, but when he refuses to stop cooking meth even after his family begs him to stop. Walter doesn't cook meth despite his family's objections. He cooks meth because of his family's objections. Because his family's objections make him feel misunderstood, and feeling misunderstood makes him feel righteous. Walter begins to see his family as obstacles to his self-actualization instead of the reason for his sacrifice. Walter begins to see Skylar's fear as nagging instead of wisdom. Walter begins to see his children's need for safety as weakness instead of humanity. This is the narcissistic injury that destroys families. When the people who love you refuse to validate the story you tell yourself about who you are. Walter expected gratitude for his sacrifices, but instead he receives fear and anger. And Walter interprets this fear and anger as evidence that his family doesn't understand him, not evidence that his behavior is genuinely frightening and anger-provoking. Walter White becomes the kind of father who demands appreciation for putting his family in danger. The kind of husband who expects praise for traumatizing his wife. The kind of man who believes that his intentions matter more than his impact. And Walter tells himself that his family's inability to appreciate his sacrifices proves they don't deserve those sacrifices. The sixth lie is the most revealing because it's when Walter stops lying to others and starts telling the truth about himself, but still refuses to take responsibility for the consequences of that truth. I am the one who knocks. The most famous line Walter White ever speaks and the most honest. Because this is the moment when Walter admits he's not the victim of circumstances. He is the circumstances. But watch the context of this speech. Skylar is afraid because she's learned that dangerous people might target their family. And instead of comforting her or reassuring her or taking steps to increase their security, Walter gets angry at her for being afraid. Walter doesn't say, "I am the one who knocks," to comfort Skylar. He says it to intimidate her. Walter wants Skylar to be afraid of him instead of afraid for him. Because if Skylar is afraid of Walter, then Walter doesn't have to face her fear for Walter. This is the masculine ego's response to causing pain. Instead of taking responsibility for the pain, blame the person in pain for not being strong enough to handle it. Walter doesn't want Skylar's fear to change his behavior. Walter wants Skylar's fear to change her expectations. Walter wants Skylar to stop expecting him to prioritize her safety over his pride. I am the one who knocks, is Walter White's declaration of independence from caring about how his choices affect other people. Walter is announcing that he's no longer going to let other people's feelings limit his actions. This is the moment when Walter White becomes fully toxic. Not because he's doing bad things but because he's stopped caring about the people his bad things hurt. Walter begins to see empathy as weakness. He begins to see other people's emotional needs as manipulation. He begins to see love as a tool people use to control him instead of a gift people offer him. Jesse starts using again because the stress of their activities is too much for him to handle sober. And instead of seeing Jesse's relapse as evidence that what they're doing is harmful, Walter sees Jesse's relapse as evidence that Jesse is unreliable. Walter doesn't ask himself why the people around him are falling apart. Walter asks himself how their falling apart affects his plans. This is the dehumanization that makes emotional abuse possible. When other people's pain becomes an inconvenience instead of a concern, Walter manipulates Jesse's addiction instead of helping him recover from it. Because a sober Jesse might make better decisions, and better decisions might not align with Walter's interests. Walter begins to see the people who love him as resources to exploit rather than relationships to nurture. Skylar becomes useful for laundering money. Jesse becomes useful for accessing distribution networks. Walter Jr. becomes useful for maintaining appearances. Walter doesn't love his family. Walter loves what his family can do for him. And when what they can do for him conflicts with what's good for them, Walter chooses what's good for him. This is the core of masculine toxicity. The belief that other people exist to serve your needs rather than having needs of their own that deserve consideration. Walter White becomes the kind of man who measures love by loyalty instead of measuring love by care. And loyalty to Walter means agreeing with him even when he's wrong and supporting him even when he's dangerous. Walter doesn't want to be loved. Walter wants to be obeyed. And he wants that obedience to feel like love so he doesn't have to face what he's actually demanding. The seventh lie is the most dangerous because it's when Walter convinces himself that his family's resistance to his choices proves they don't love him enough to understand his sacrifices. Jane's death. This is where Walter White crosses the line from anti-hero to villain, and he does it by choosing not to act rather than choosing to act. Jane is choking on her own vomit and Walter watches her die. Walter could save her life, but saving her life would complicate his control over Jesse. So Walter lets her die and tells himself it's not murder because he didn't actively kill her. This is the masculine shadow's most sophisticated lie. The belief that allowing something bad to happen is morally different from making something bad happen. Walter doesn't push Jane. Walter doesn't inject Jane with heroin. But Walter does make the choice to let Jane die when he could save her life. And Walter makes that choice not because Jane deserves to die, but because Jane's death serves Walter's interests. This is calculated evil disguised as moral passivity. Walter wants Jane dead, so Walter allows Jane to die, and then tells himself that he's not responsible for her death. But watch Walter after Jane dies. He's not traumatized by witnessing her death. He's not guilty about his inaction. He's relieved that a problem has solved itself. Walter begins to see other people's deaths as solutions to his problems rather than tragedies that demand justice. Because Walter has convinced himself that his problems are more important than other people's lives. Jesse is destroyed by Jane's death. Jesse blames himself, spirals into addiction and becomes suicidal. And instead of helping Jesse process his grief, Walter uses Jesse's grief to manipulate him. Walter tells Jesse that Jane's death was an overdose, a consequence of the lifestyle Jesse chose. Walter doesn't comfort Jesse. Walter lectures Jesse. Because Walter needs Jesse to believe that Jane's death was Jesse's fault, not Walter's choice. This is the emotional violence that toxic fathers inflict on their children. Taking responsibility for the good things that happen and assigning responsibility for the bad things that happen. Walter begins to see himself as the victim of other people's poor choices rather than the architect of the situations that forced those choices. Jesse wouldn't be using drugs if Walter hadn't put him in situations too stressful to handle sober. Jane wouldn't have been in danger if Walter hadn't involved Jesse in the drug trade. But Walter doesn't see the chain of causation that leads back to his original decision to cook meth. Walter only sees the immediate choices other people make, not the impossible positions his choices put them in. This is the narcissistic worldview that makes accountability impossible. Walter becomes the center of the universe, the only person whose choices matter, the only person whose motivations deserve consideration. Everyone else is just reacting to Walter, but Walter never has to consider whether the reactions he's provoking might be reasonable responses to unreasonable situations. Walter doesn't see Jane's death as the consequence of his decision to involve Jesse in the drug trade. Walter sees Jane's death as the consequence of Jesse's decision to use drugs. Walter doesn't see Jesse's addiction as a response to trauma. Walter sees Jesse's addiction as a character flaw that makes Jesse unreliable. Walter doesn't see Skylar's fear as a rational response to genuine danger. Walter sees Skylar's fear as emotional manipulation designed to control his behavior. Walter White becomes the kind of man who takes credit for every positive outcome and assigns blame for every negative outcome. The kind of man who sees himself as the hero of everyone else's story. And Walter tells himself this perspective is realistic rather than narcissistic. Walter tells himself he's the only one clear-eyed enough to see situations objectively. But Walter isn't objective. Walter is completely subjective, completely self-centered, completely incapable of seeing any perspective other than his own. The eighth lie is the most seductive because it transforms Walter's selfishness into a form of self-sacrifice, his narcissism into a form of nobility. Walter White begins to believe that he's the only person strong enough to make the hard choices that protect the people he loves. This is the savior complex that justifies every form of control and manipulation. Gus threatens Walter's family, and Walter responds not by removing his family from danger, but by removing Gus from existence. Because Walter has convinced himself that he can solve problems through violence more effectively than he can solve them through wisdom. Walter doesn't move his family to a safe location. Walter doesn't accept witness protection. Walter doesn't disappear. Walter escalates. Because escalation makes Walter feel powerful, and feeling powerful matters more to Walter than being safe. This is the masculine delusion that strength means never backing down, never compromising, never admitting that some fights can't be won. Walter poisons a child to manipulate Jesse into helping him kill Gus. Think about that. Walter uses a child as a pawn in his war against Gus, and tells himself it's justified because he calculated the dosage to be non-fatal. This is evil with a college education. Walter doesn't poison Brock because he wants to hurt Brock. Walter poisons Brock because he needs Jesse to think Gus poisoned Brock. Walter is willing to traumatize a child and risk that child's life to manipulate another person's emotions. But Walter tells himself that poisoning Brock is strategic rather than sadistic. Walter tells himself that Brock was never in real danger because Walter is too smart to miscalculate a dosage. Walter tells himself that what he did to Brock is acceptable because what Gus might do to Walter's family would be worse. This is the utilitarian math that makes any evil act justifiable. If I do a small evil to prevent a larger evil, then my small evil becomes good. But Walter doesn't know that Gus would actually hurt Walter's family. Walter assumes Gus would hurt Walter's family because that's what Walter would do in Gus's position. Walter projects his own moral flexibility onto everyone else, and then uses their assumed moral flexibility to justify his actual moral flexibility. Jesse discovers that Walter poisoned Brock, and instead of remorse, Walter feels betrayed. Because Jesse's anger makes Walter feel misunderstood rather than making Walter question whether his actions were understandable. This is the narcissistic injury that makes apology impossible. Walter doesn't feel bad about what he did to Brock. Walter feels bad that Jesse won't appreciate why Walter did what he did to Brock. Walter begins to see moral opposition to his choices as intellectual opposition to his intelligence. People who think Walter's actions are wrong aren't more ethical than Walter. They're less capable of complex moral reasoning than Walter. Walter doesn't see Jesse's horror at the poisoning as evidence of Jesse's humanity. Walter sees it as evidence of Jesse's naivety. Walter has convinced himself that moral complexity is the same thing as moral superiority. That being willing to do terrible things for complicated reasons makes him more sophisticated than people who refuse to do terrible things for any reason. Walter White becomes the kind of man who mistakes ruthlessness for wisdom, cruelty for pragmatism, manipulation for strategy. And Walter tells himself that people who can't appreciate his sophisticated approach to problem solving are too simple to understand what leadership requires. Walter doesn't see himself as a man who lost his moral compass. Walter sees himself as a man who found the courage to navigate without one. The ninth lie is the most destructive because it's when Walter begins to believe that other people's inability to match his capacity for evil proves they don't love him enough to become evil for him. Walter kills Gus, but instead of ending the business, Walter expands it. Because Walter tells himself that he's built something too valuable to abandon, too important to surrender, too impressive to give up. But what Walter has actually built is an identity. For the first time in his life, Walter White is feared and respected. For the first time in his life, people speak Walter White's name with reverence. For the first time in his life, Walter White matters. And Walter would rather die as someone who matters than live as someone who doesn't. This is the masculine ego's ultimate trap. The belief that significance requires dominance, that importance requires intimidation, that respect requires fear. Walter doesn't cook meth because his family needs money. Walter cooks meth because cooking meth makes him feel like Heisenberg, and being Heisenberg is the only time Walter White has ever felt alive. Mike Ehrmantraut becomes Walter's partner, and the contrast is revealing. Mike is everything Walter pretends to be. Mike is actually professional. Mike is actually calm under pressure. Mike is actually strategic in his thinking. But Mike is also everything Walter hates about himself. Mike doesn't need to feel important. Mike doesn't need to feel dominant. Mike doesn't need other people to validate his competence. Mike does the work without needing the work to define who he is. And Walter can't understand how someone can be good at something without needing everyone to know they're good at it. Walter begins to sabotage his partnership with Mike not because Mike is incompetent, but because Mike's competence makes Walter feel incompetent. Walter can't work with someone who doesn't need Walter to feel superior to them. Jesse starts to pull away from Walter, starts to question Walter's decisions, starts to see patterns in Walter's behavior that make Jesse uncomfortable. And instead of asking himself why the people closest to him are becoming uncomfortable with him, Walter asks himself how their discomfort affects his ability to control them. Walter doesn't see Jesse's growing independence as Jesse's personal growth. Walter sees it as Jesse's betrayal of their partnership. Walter doesn't see Jesse's moral objections as Jesse developing a conscience. Walter sees them as Jesse becoming unreliable. Walter begins to treat Jesse's humanity as a bug in their system rather than a feature of their friendship. This is the dehumanization that makes abuse inevitable. When other people's autonomous thoughts and feelings become obstacles to your plans rather than information that should influence your plans. Walter starts making unilateral decisions about their business and then getting angry when Jesse objects to not being consulted. Walter doesn't want Jesse as a partner. Walter wants Jesse as an employee who thinks he's a partner. Walter doesn't want collaboration. Walter wants the appearance of collaboration without any of the actual sharing of power that real collaboration requires. Mike calls Walter out on his ego, his recklessness, his need for attention. And instead of self-reflection, Walter responds with resentment. Because Walter has convinced himself that anyone who criticizes him is either too stupid to understand his brilliance or too threatened by his success to judge him fairly. Walter White becomes incapable of receiving feedback because Walter White has convinced himself that he's beyond the need for feedback. And Walter tells himself that his imperviousness to criticism proves his strength rather than revealing his fragility. The 10th lie is the most pathetic because it's when Walter realizes that his family doesn't want his sacrifices, but he continues making those sacrifices anyway because he needs to believe they're necessary. Skylar's breakdown. The moment when the woman Walter claims to love most becomes so traumatized by his behavior that she can barely function, and Walter's response is irritation rather than concern. Skylar walks into the pool fully clothed, and Walter's first worry isn't for Skylar's mental health. Walter's first worry is for how Skylar's behavior affects his reputation with Hank and Marie. Walter doesn't see Skylar's breakdown as evidence that his choices are destroying her. Walter sees Skylar's breakdown as evidence that she's not strong enough to handle the life he's created for them. This is the emotional violence of toxic masculinity. When the people you love break under the pressure of your choices, the problem isn't your choices. The problem is their weakness. Walter tells himself that Skylar's depression is temporary, that she'll adjust, that she'll eventually appreciate what he's done for her. But Skylar isn't adjusting. Skylar is dying inside. And Walter chooses not to see it because seeing it would require him to change his behavior. Walter Jr. starts to notice that something is wrong with his parents' marriage, and instead of addressing the underlying issues, Walter focuses on managing his son's perception of those issues. Walter doesn't want to fix his relationship with Skylar. Walter wants to hide his relationship problems from Walter Jr. Walter doesn't care if his family is happy. Walter cares if his family appears happy to outsiders. This is the performance of masculine success. The need for everyone to believe your life is working even when your life is falling apart. Walter becomes more invested in the image of his family than in the reality of his family. Jesse starts seeing a therapist and begins to understand that his relationship with Walter might not be as healthy as he thought. And Walter's response isn't support for Jesse's mental health journey. Walter's response is concern that Jesse might reveal their business to his therapist. Walter doesn't want Jesse to get better. Walter wants Jesse to stay broken in ways that make Jesse dependent on Walter. Because if Jesse gets healthy, Jesse might realize that Walter is toxic. And if Jesse realizes Walter is toxic, Jesse might leave. And if Jesse leaves, Walter loses the one person who still believes Walter is important. Walter begins to see other people's healing as a threat to his control over them. This is the parasitic nature of toxic relationships. The toxic person needs the other person to stay damaged, so the other person continues needing the toxic person. Walter starts sabotaging Jesse's attempts at sobriety, his attempts at healthy relationships, his attempts at building a life separate from their business. Because Walter needs Jesse to need Walter. And if Jesse becomes self-sufficient, Walter becomes obsolete. Walter doesn't love Jesse. Walter loves being needed by Jesse. And there's a difference between those two things that Walter refuses to acknowledge. Walter tells himself that he's protecting Jesse from the world, but what Walter is actually doing is protecting himself from Jesse's independence. And Walter tells himself that Jesse's dependence on him proves their partnership is working rather than proving their partnership is destroying Jesse. The 11th lie is the most revealing because it's when Walter admits he enjoys the violence but still insists the violence is necessary rather than optional. Hank discovers that Walter is Heisenberg and everything changes. Because Hank represents everything Walter has spent his life feeling inadequate compared to. Hank is the masculine ideal that Walter always wanted to be. Hank is respected in his profession, admired by his colleagues, feared by criminals, and loved by his family without having to terrorize them into submission. Hank achieved everything Walter wanted to achieve through actual competence rather than through manipulation and violence. And now Hank knows that Walter's success is built on lies, crimes, and the destruction of innocent people. Walter's first response isn't shame or regret. Walter's first response is strategy. How can Walter neutralize Hank as a threat while maintaining plausible deniability for his neutralization? This is the moment when Walter stops pretending he's not a predator and starts planning to prey on his own family. Walter doesn't see Hank's discovery as an opportunity for confession and redemption. Walter sees it as a problem that needs to be solved through whatever means necessary. Walter calls Jack's gang to kill Hank and tells himself it's because Hank won't stop investigating, won't accept a plea deal, won't agree to look the other way. But the truth is Walter calls Jack's gang to kill Hank because Hank's existence threatens Walter's narrative about himself. As long as Hank is alive, Walter has to face the reality of what he's become compared to what Hank represents. As long as Hank is alive, Walter has to confront the fact that there are better ways to be a man than the way Walter chose to be a man. Walter doesn't kill Hank because Hank is dangerous to Walter's freedom. Walter kills Hank because Hank is dangerous to Walter's self-concept. Jesse finally understands that Walter has been manipulating him for years, poisoning children to control his emotions, lying about his motivations, using Jesse's addiction and trauma as tools for compliance. And Walter's response to Jesse's awakening isn't apology or explanation. Walter's response is rage that Jesse dares to judge him after everything Walter has done for Jesse. Walter doesn't see Jesse's anger as a reasonable response to years of manipulation. Walter sees Jesse's anger as betrayal of their partnership. Walter tells Jack's gang to kill Jesse, and in that moment, Walter reveals what kind of father he really is. The kind who will murder his children rather than let them judge him. Because that's what Jesse represents to Walter. Not a partner, not a friend, but a son. And Walter would rather kill his son than face his son's disappointment in who his father became. This is the ultimate masculine betrayal. The father who destroys his children to protect his ego from their criticism. Walter doesn't order Jesse's death because Jesse threatens his business. Walter orders Jesse's death because Jesse threatens his delusion that he's still the good guy in this story. And when Jack's gang captures Jesse instead of killing him, when they enslave Jesse to cook for them, Walter feels satisfied rather than horrified. Because Jesse's enslavement proves to Walter that Jesse needed Walter's protection, even though Walter is the reason Jesse needs protection. Walter drives away from the desert where Hank died, where he ordered Jesse's death, and tells himself that he did what he had to do to protect what remained of his family. But Walter didn't protect his family. Walter destroyed his family to protect his secrets from his family. Walter returns home to find Skylar and Walter Jr. terrified of him, and instead of seeing their fear as a reasonable response to his behavior, Walter sees their fear as evidence that they've been poisoned against him by outside influences. Walter doesn't ask himself why his family is afraid of him. Walter asks himself who made his family afraid of him. This is the victim mentality that makes accountability impossible. Walter becomes the victim of everyone else's reactions to his choices rather than the cause of those reactions. The 12th lie is the most desperate because it's when Walter realizes he's lost everything he claims he was trying to protect, but he still insists that losing everything was worth it because of what he accomplished in the process. Walter Jr. learns the truth about his father and rejects him completely. The son Walter claims he did everything for wants nothing to do with him. And Walter's response isn't grief at losing his son's love. Walter's response is anger at his son's ingratitude for Walter's sacrifices. Walter doesn't see Walter Jr.'s rejection as the natural consequence of Walter's choices. Walter sees it as evidence that Walter Jr. is too weak to understand what Walter went through to provide for him. This is the narcissistic injury that makes love impossible. When other people's autonomous responses to your behavior become evidence of their character defects rather than information about your behavior's impact. Walter kidnaps his own daughter and calls Skylar to demand that she take responsibility for the family's destruction. Walter doesn't see himself as the man who put his family in danger, lied to his wife, manipulated his children, and murdered his brother-in-law. Walter sees himself as the man who made sacrifices that his family was too selfish to appreciate. Even in his final phone call to Skylar, Walter is more concerned with how history will judge him than with how his actions affected her. Walter doesn't want Skylar's forgiveness. Walter wants Skylar's testimony that he was a good man who got caught up in bad circumstances. Walter doesn't want to make amends for what he's done. Walter wants validation that what he's done was understandable. This is the difference between accountability and self-pity. Accountability focuses on impact and repair. Self-pity focuses on intention and justification. Walter White never becomes accountable because Walter White never stops believing that his intentions justify his impact. Walter goes into hiding, and in his isolation he has the opportunity for genuine self-reflection. He could use this time to truly understand what he's done and why he's done it. Instead, Walter uses this time to plan his return and his revenge against the people he believes betrayed him. Because Walter still doesn't see his exile as the consequence of his choices. Walter sees his exile as the result of other people's inability to appreciate his choices. Walter watches Elliot and Gretchen on television talking about gray matter, and instead of reflecting on how his pride cost him his share of a billion-dollar company, Walter focuses on how unfairly they're treating his memory. Walter doesn't see Elliot and Gretchen's success as evidence that there were other paths he could have taken. Walter sees their success as theft of credit that rightfully belongs to him. Walter returns to Albuquerque not to make amends, not to repair relationships, not to take responsibility for what he's done. Walter returns to settle scores with people who dared to judge him and to ensure that his version of events becomes the official version of events. The 13th lie is the most tragic because it's when Walter finally tells the truth about his motivations. But by then the truth is too little, too late to save anyone or anything he destroyed. Walter's final confrontation with Skylar. The moment when he finally admits what we've known all along but what he spent 5 seasons denying. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. This is the confession that redeems nothing because it comes after Walter has already destroyed everything worth redeeming. Walter doesn't confess because he's sorry. Walter confesses because he's proud. Walter doesn't admit the truth to make amends. Walter admits the truth to claim credit. Even in his moment of apparent honesty, Walter is still performing. Still trying to control how Skylar sees him, still trying to manage his legacy, still trying to be the author of his own story. Walter's confession isn't about Skylar's need to understand. Walter's confession is about Walter's need to be understood as he wants to be understood. Walter doesn't say, "I'm sorry for what I put you through." Walter says, "I want you to know why I put you through it." This is the narcissist's version of accountability. Not taking responsibility for impact but taking credit for intention. Walter wants Skylar to appreciate the complexity of his motivations even though the complexity of his motivations doesn't change the simplicity of their impact on her life. Walter kills Jack's gang not to save Jesse, but to reclaim his product, his formula, his legacy. Walter doesn't see Jesse's enslavement as an injustice that demands correction. Walter sees it as theft of his intellectual property that demands retaliation. Even Walter's final act of apparent redemption is actually an act of ego protection. Walter doesn't free Jesse because he loves Jesse. Walter frees Jesse because Jesse belongs to Walter, and nobody gets to abuse what belongs to Walter except Walter. Walter dies in the meth lab, surrounded by the equipment that made him feel powerful, holding the product that made him feel important. Walter doesn't die saving his family. Walter dies protecting his legacy. Walter doesn't die a hero's death. Walter dies a villain's death, but he dies satisfied because he got to die as the villain he always wanted to be rather than live as the nobody he always feared becoming. And in his final moments, Walter isn't thinking about the people he hurt or the lives he destroyed or the family he traumatized. Walter is thinking about how beautiful his creation is, how perfect his formula was, how impressed people will be when they understand what he accomplished. Walter White dies as he lived, thinking about himself. The 14th truth is the most important because it's not about Walter White at all. It's about every father watching this story and recognizing pieces of themselves in the monster Walter became. Walter White isn't an aberration. Walter White is an extreme example of patterns that exist in ordinary men. The need to feel important even when feeling important requires making others feel unimportant. The need to feel powerful even when feeling powerful requires making others feel powerless. The need to feel right even when being right requires making others feel wrong. These aren't the motivations of psychopaths. These are the motivations of men who were taught that masculinity means dominance and that dominance means someone has to lose for you to win. Every father watching this story has felt the temptation to prioritize their ego over their family's well-being. Every husband watching this story has felt the urge to make unilateral decisions and call them protection. Every man watching this story has felt the pull to measure their worth by their ability to control rather than their ability to connect. Walter White is what happens when those temptations win. When those urges go unchecked. When that pull becomes a gravitational force that warps everything around it. The tragedy of Walter White isn't that he started as a good man and became a bad man. The tragedy is that he started as an ordinary man and became exactly what ordinary men become when they never question whether their definitions of strength are actually forms of weakness. Walter White never asked himself whether being feared was really better than being loved. Walter White never asked himself whether being respected was really more important than being trusted. Walter White never asked himself whether being powerful was really more valuable than being present. And because Walter never asked himself these questions, Walter never discovered that the answer to all of them is no. The masculine shadow that destroyed Walter White exists in every man. The difference between Walter White and better men isn't that better men don't have that shadow. The difference is that better men acknowledge their shadow, question their shadow, and choose not to feed their shadow even when feeding it would feel good. Walter White fed his shadow until it consumed everything he claimed to love. And the most terrifying part of Walter White's story isn't that he became a monster. The most terrifying part is how reasonable each individual step toward monstrosity seemed at the time he was taking it. Walter White didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy his family. Walter White made a series of small choices that prioritized his comfort over their safety, his pride over their peace, his ego over their well-being. And each choice made the next choice easier until choosing destruction became as natural as choosing breakfast. This is how ordinary fathers become toxic fathers. Not through dramatic moments of conscious evil, but through accumulating moments of unconscious selfishness. Not by deciding to harm their families, but by deciding that their families can handle the harm if it means the fathers don't have to handle the discomfort of change. Walter White is the father you become when you stop asking whether you're being the father your family needs and start insisting that your family appreciate the father you've decided to be. Walter White is the husband you become when you stop asking whether you're making your wife's life better and start demanding that your wife make your life easier. Walter White is the man you become when you stop growing and start defending who you already are against all evidence that who you are might not be working. The 15th and final truth is the one that Breaking Bad doesn't want you to see because it would ruin the show's central mythology. Walter White was never a good man who did bad things for good reasons. Walter White was always a selfish man who found increasingly elaborate ways to disguise his selfishness as sacrifice. The cancer didn't change Walter White. The cancer gave Walter White permission to stop pretending to be someone he never was. The drug business didn't corrupt Walter White. The drug business revealed what Walter White was willing to do when he thought no one would judge him for doing it. Gus Fring didn't threaten Walter White's family. Walter White threatened Walter White's family by involving them in Gus Fring's world. Jesse Pinkman didn't betray Walter White. Jesse Pinkman grew beyond his need for Walter White's approval. Skylar White didn't fail to appreciate Walter's sacrifices. Skylar White recognized that Walter's sacrifices were actually Walter's choices and that Walter's choices were destroying everything she loved about their life together. Hank Schrader didn't force Walter White into a corner. Hank Schrader held Walter White accountable for his choices. The tragedy of Walter White isn't that good intentions led to bad outcomes. The tragedy is that selfish intentions were disguised as good intentions until the disguise became impossible to maintain. Walter White represents every man who's ever used the people he loves as an excuse to indulge the worst parts of himself. Every man who's ever worked late not because the work needed to be done but because work felt better than home. Every man who's ever made a financial decision without consulting his wife not because consultation was impossible but because consultation might mean hearing no. Every man who's ever disciplined his children not because they needed discipline but because disciplining them made him feel authoritative. Every man who's ever picked a fight not because the fight needed to happen but because winning the fight would make him feel powerful. Every man who's ever prioritized being right over being kind, being strong over being vulnerable, being independent over being connected. Walter White is the logical endpoint of masculinity that defines itself through domination rather than collaboration, through fear rather than love, through control rather than trust. And the most dangerous part of Walter White's story isn't that he became a monster. The most dangerous part is how many people still see him as a hero. Because as long as we see Walter White as a tragic figure rather than a cautionary tale, as long as we focus on his intelligence rather than his impact, as long as we admire his determination rather than examine his destinations, we're in danger of becoming him. Walter White isn't the man you fear your father might have been. Walter White is the man you fear you might become if you never question whether the stories you tell yourself about masculinity are actually stories about selfishness. Walter White is what happens when providing for your family becomes more important than being present with your family. Walter White is what happens when protecting your family becomes more important than connecting with your family. Walter White is what happens when being respected becomes more important than being loved. Walter White died as he lived. Alone with his accomplishments, admiring his own work, convinced that everyone else was too small to appreciate what he'd built. He got exactly what he wanted. He became feared, respected, and remembered. He also lost everything that actually mattered. His wife's trust, his children's love, his brother-in-law's respect, his students' loyalty. Walter White achieved significance by destroying everything significant in his life. And the question every father watching needs to answer is simple. What are you willing to destroy to feel important? Because whatever your answer is, that's exactly what you'll lose. Walter White thought he was building an empire. He was actually building a graveyard. And every relationship he buried there was buried alive. The shadow father isn't the father who abandons his family. The shadow father is the father who destroys his family while insisting he's saving it. The shadow father isn't the father who doesn't love his children. The shadow father is the father who loves his image as a father more than he loves his actual children. The shadow father isn't the father who doesn't provide. The shadow father is the father who provides everything except what his family actually needs from him. His presence instead of his productivity. His vulnerability instead of his strength. His love instead of his fear. Walter White had 50 years to learn how to be a father, a husband, a man. Instead, he spent 50 years learning how to look like a father, a husband, a man while never actually becoming one. And when the performance became impossible to maintain, instead of learning to be authentic, Walter chose to be authentically terrible. Walter White is every father's shadow. The question is whether you'll acknowledge that shadow before it acknowledges you. Because your family is watching. And they're deciding right now whether you're their protector or their greatest threat. Walter White chose to be the danger.